Hey class, welcome back. If you check out the board behind me, I'll go through a little bit of what we've done in the second half of week 32. Also getting ready for Dr. Guccione to visit us next week and talk about plant structure and function. And we started with a brain pop today. And on the brain pop, it was talking just a little bit about some things that hopefully we already knew. Plants, of course, are eukaryotic, one of the three eukaryotic kingdoms. And if you look at plants, contain cellulose. Cellulose being the hard cell wall, pretty much, of plants. And one of the things that we talked a little bit about was you're probably in a room watching this right now that is being held up by plants, by cellulose anyway, by wood. Right in this classroom right here, we of course have big beams across the ceiling that are made of wood. Some buildings of course are held up by steel, but this is a wood building that I'm in right now. So when you really look at all the uses that we put plants to, it's really kind of stunningly amazing. Also, most plants come from seeds. Some come from spores and some reproduce vegetatively, but most come from seeds, and we're going to talk a lot about seeds in just a second here. We started talking a little bit with a picture of Lake Tahoe. Some of you have seen Lake Tahoe before. Gorgeous lake up in the High Sierra, 6,000 feet at the surface. And if you're looking at Lake Tahoe, they've gone down deep with submarines in the Lake Tahoe, little submersibles, and they found tree stumps growing in about 70, 80 feet of water. This tells us something about the California climate. It tells us that we've had tremendously long droughts. Right now we're experiencing a drought, of course, but we know over the course of history in California that we've had probably some pretty long droughts, because if trees are going to get established, they got to have some dry land for a while upon which to grow. Yeah, those are covered up by water now, but that means that the level of Lake Tahoe must have been much lower at one time. So that being said, another way we can check the climate is with trees, tree rings. We went outside in the campus day. Those who were here on campus day, we went outside, looked at a tree stump. On the tree stump, you can see the rings, the concentric circles that make up that tree stump. I'm going to ask you to remember xylem versus phloem. Xylem takes the water around the plant. Phloem takes the food around the plant, basically. And you're looking at the phloem as sort of the outside layer here, and the xylem is on the inside, and you can tell what the climate was on any particular year by drilling into the tree, counting the rings, but not just counting the rings, seeing the relative thickness. A very thick ring tells us that probably that year it was a great growing year, had a lot of water. A very, very thin ring tells us, of course, that it probably didn't have much water. We can even tell really cool things like this, like when there was volcanic eruptions. Remember, volcanic eruptions sometimes, because of like sulfur dioxide, will block out a little bit of sunlight, and we can coordinate the different tree ring studies around the world and say, hey, you know, on these years all around the world, there seemed to be less going on in the growing season. So this tells us maybe that particular year there might have been something blocking out the sunlight. A lot of very, very useful science comes out of something called dendrochronology. Fancy way of saying, hey, studying tree rings. From there, we moved on a little bit to flowers. Let me see if I can get the screen lined up here so you can see it. But I would like you, please, to draw your own flower in your text. And by drawing your own flower, again, we're going after the parts of the flower. And this particular picture is in our text. You can find these all over the place online. The big takeaway is the following. Flowering plants are a relative newcomer to us here on Earth. 130 million years ago, roughly, they developed. There was a lot of ferns before that. Now, ferns, mosses, liverworts, they reproduce not with seeds, but with spores. Seed plants had a tremendous advantage over something with spores because seeds can last for a very long time before they germinate or start to grow. Remember from when we went outside and we saw some flowers out there, the flowers are putting out a signal. They're saying, hey, pollinators, come on in, do you a little trade. Tell you what, I'll give you a little bit of nectar. You take this pollen to another flower, and if everything goes just right, the pollinators, particularly the bees, will pollinate, or the gametes will get together in the ovary here. That ovary then will develop into the fruit. This right here is the basis of our fruit crops and our seed crops in California and around the world. Extraordinarily important, and we'll go into this in more detail with Dr. Guccione next week. But when you look at the parts of a flower, there's a good reason we're learning about this. For example, pollinators, like bees most importantly, are essential to not only our crops, but just the health of the ecosystem as a whole. Do you remember when, hopefully, you remember when Dr. Guccione talked about how we should never use poisons, for example, for things like rodents, because they can work their way up the food chain and affect the apex predators. In a similar way, we should really, really try to avoid using any herbicides. Things like Roundup that you see occasionally. I saw someone doing this a little while ago. I wanted to say, stop. They were spraying Roundup in the cracks of a sidewalk outside because they didn't like the weeds, what they considered weeds growing in the cracks of the sidewalk. Terrible for the environment. As a matter of fact, not only does Roundup, we now know, cause, we think, some neurological problems, but you're spraying poison around the environment that then, again, works its way into the food chain. This stuff doesn't go away. When you're looking at the bees, which are important pollinators, we know that some of the bee colonies have completely collapsed, at least partly because of pesticides. So you're looking at a part of our environment which is critically important for the health of the ecosystem as a whole, which is why we're learning about plants. In your homework, this week we have our week 32 test, but also please take a little time, remember my HW, my little homework symbol there, take a little time, write in, you can find it in your textbook, page 296 specifically, or you can find it all over the internet and Google it, and I will put some links in your notes in your Google Classroom and also at pacificascience.org. Write down the life cycle of a flowering plant. That's where I'm going to leave it today. We talked a tiny bit, if you were on campus, about conifers, which are almost like flowering plants. They are, let me reach over here for a second, show you a big old cone. They produce cones like this. In the early spring, they produce something that's kind of like a flower, but not quite. Real quick, full circle tie-in with good old Lake Tahoe where we started the whole talk. There's these big sugar pines that grow up near where I love to camp up there. A place called DL Bliss is right near Emerald Bay. If you've ever seen it, or if you've never seen it, look it up online. These really, really big cones, they have seeds, of course. We talked about that, seeds inside here. These sugar pines, you really learn very quickly never to park underneath them. If you were, parking your car there at your campsite, never to walk underneath them and stay too long or camp underneath them, because as gorgeous as they are, the chipmunks and the squirrels up there have learned that they can bite around the top up here, drop these cones, and then they run down the tree, eat all the seeds out of the cones. But when these things fall out of the tree, they fall from a good, 50, 60 feet sometimes. They hit the ground, so it's like a bowling ball hitting the ground, so you gotta be careful of that. But when you look at conifers, they do produce seeds, but they don't produce flowers, not true flowers. When I say true flowers, I'm talking about all of the parts that you see here. Again, I'll put these notes out there online. Have a great day, great end of your week 32, and we'll see you next week for week 33. Bye-bye.